In Munich, hopes burn bright that the Olympics will go off without incident.
I was just thrilled to be at an Olympic Games.
The Games were meant to suggest an image of Germany as a free, well-organized, but not particularly strict society.
This is an ITN newsflash from the Olympic Village in Munich.
Something serious had happened, and I got into the broadcast center and I found out.
The drama started when Arab gunmen from the Black September group held the Israelis as hostages.
Isn't there any security that they should let people in and do these things?
Everybody, including the terrorists, could watch on television that German policemen dressed in tracksuits were trying to storm the building.
I think they ought to suspend the Olympics until such time as the situation is cleared up.
The world increasingly became aware of what was going on.
It's like an image from a horror film.
The head appears as if it was a skull and reminded the world of the kind of violent disruption of what was meant to be peaceful and joyful games.
And seconds later, the second helicopter was racked by an explosion and burst into flames.
It's very difficult, as we've found out many times, to stop people who don't mind if they are killed in what they're trying to do.
The Olympics are on their way again, as if we need reminding. Whatever the sport, you'll find it here. Long jump, discus throwing.
The president of Germany, Gustav Heinemann, said that the whole idea was to overcome hatred and to pave the way for reconciliation. And that was what the Games were about as far as the Germans were concerned. The fact that here were a team of sportsmen and women competing on behalf of Israel, competing on German soil, was a huge thing.
For an international audience, 1972 was meant to reverse impressions that 1936 had left and try to suggest exactly the kind of opposite impressions of what Germany was.
They wanted everybody to forget 1936, which of course was the Hitler Games.
In Munich, hopes burn bright that the Olympics will go off without incident as the torch is borne to the top of the stadium.
I was just thrilled to be at an Olympic Games.
By the second week, the Carefree Games had been just that, and there'd been no issues as medals were won and the worldwide audience enjoyed the spectacle.
The Games were meant to suggest an image of Germany as a informal, light, free, well-organized, but not particularly strict society. The security service was dressed not in police uniforms, but in light blue uniforms by the French designer Courrèges. These were unarmed policemen, and their job was actually to help people to de-escalate potentially dangerous situations.
Everybody was wanting to help in some way. And it was a lovely atmosphere.
This is an ITN newsflash from the Olympic Village in Munich.
At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of September, a commando of Black September, a PLO faction, climbed over a fence in the Olympic Village and stormed a flat in Connolly Street, which was inhabited by Israeli athletes, and immediately killed Yossi Romano and Boische Weinberg, who tried to defend themselves against this attack.
I turned on the television, which obviously was only in German, and there didn't seem to be many athletics things going on.
A group of Arab Palestinians terrorists rushed inside the building, killed the coach of our wrestlers, Moshe Weinberg, and took as hostages some of our sportsmen.
Something serious had happened, and I got into the broadcast center and I found out as much as anybody knew at the time.
The drama started when Arab gunmen from the Black September group held the Israelis as hostages. Among their demands was the release of 200 Arab prisoners held in Israel.
The concern and the fear was with possible knowledge of what had happened and greater fear of what might still happen. And how do you stop it?
Around 9 a.m., the Munich police chief, Manfred Schreiber, started to negotiate for the release of the hostages with terrorist spokesman Issa.
The Arab Palestinians are in control of the Israeli bloc?
I don't know if the whole block, but at least at one of the entrances, which have some of the Israeli sportsmen there.
Gentlemen, I had the opportunity this morning to call Prime Minister Mayer on the phone. I expressed sympathy on behalf of all of the American people for the victims of this murderous act that has occurred at the Olympic Village in Munich. I also told her that she could expect total cooperation from the government of the United States in any way that would be helpful in obtaining the release of the hostages.
Golda Meir, the Israeli Prime Minister, said that no deal would be made and Israel would be tough like it usually was in such hostage situations.
It just makes your blood cringe to see these things going on.
As far as I'm concerned, they ought to shoot those guerrillas on sight.
Isn't there any security that they should let people in and do these things?
Everybody had come there with a knowledge of worldly affairs among the commentary and presenting team. And then suddenly there had been this terrorist attack.
The German government offered all kinds of concessions to the hostage takers, political asylum, huge amount of money, and misread the intentions of the Palestinians. These were all young men in their teens and early 20s who saw themselves as soldiers and were willing to die for the Palestinian cause.
As the negotiations wore on, the Olympics continued.
Nearly 500 German security police have now sealed off the village and are mounting heavy machine guns in the square.
The terrorists then set a deadline for 12 noon and said that if the political prisoners were not released, they would kill the hostages.
As it dragged on during the day, it moved from this couldn't possibly have happened to appreciation that it had and what it meant and the fear that it was going to cost many lives.
The Munich authorities then had to start thinking about what they might possibly do to liberate those hostages.
German authorities were so concerned for Jewish swimming superstar Mark Spitz, they secretly got him out of the country as the pressure mounted on the police.
They are keeping cameramen and television reporters and spectators well away.
The terrorists again issued a new deadline of 5 p.m. for the prisoners to be released.
There were warnings, if this doesn't happen in the next hour, we'll kill another one. That was the message that came through. This bargaining chip, but the bargaining chip were human beings.
Several hours after the first athlete had been murdered, the International Olympic Committee suspended the Games as it came under growing criticism from around the world.
It's a terrible, terrible thing. I think they ought to suspend the Olympics until such time as the situation is cleared up.
With just 30 minutes until the terrorists would execute the hostages, 38 West German police officers were sent to the Olympic Village.
This would have been an attempt to storm the flat from the top of the building.
Immediately, the German police, some wearing tracksuits, covered the Israeli athlete headquarters.
There was no news blackout. Everybody, including the terrorists, could watch on television that German policemen dressed in tracksuits were trying to storm the building.
There is an argument that television should never have shown it, because not only did it empower the world to know what was going on, which of course was the job of television, but it empowered the terrorists inside the building to see what was going on.
As yet another deadline passed, the police were given the order to stop the mission as the terrorists watched them on live TV.
The world increasingly became aware of what was going on.
52.58 seconds. The media had gathered for the Olympics, but now trained their lenses on the breaking news before them to try and capture the moment that could define the story.
It's like an image from a horror film. It's the darkness, the horror, the darkness of the threat of the unreasoning murderer. The person who has no compunction, no compassion,
The head appears as if it was a skull and reminded the world of the kind of violent disruption of what was meant to be a peaceful and joyful games. The black and white obviously contrasts fantastically with the color that Munich was meant to project to the world. The Palestinians knew that was a way for them to use that event to advertise the plight of the Palestinian people and the conflict with Israel, which 900 million people now actually had to watch play out in the Olympic Village before the eyes of the world.
That photo, actually, you couldn't see a face, but it became the face of terrorism.
This is an ITN news flash from the Olympic Village in Munich.
Something serious had happened, and I got into the broadcast center and I found out.
After terrorists stormed the Israeli team's apartment at the 1972 Munich Olympics.
The Arab Palestinians are in control of the Israeli bloc?
I don't know if the whole block, but at least at one of the entrances.
Killing 2 and taking several hostages, a tense standoff was taking place.
The German government misread the intentions of the Palestinians. These were all young men who saw themselves as soldiers and were willing to die for the Palestinian cause.
And as the media tried to show the world what was going on, one photograph was taken that symbolized the sheer terror of what was happening at the Carefree Games.
In context, of course, we haven't had such a degree of violence in mainland Europe since the end of the war. The fact was, really, that it was happening in Europe, in Munich.
Figures seen in the windows by gathering throngs are those of Arab guerrillas holding Israeli athletes hostage. The suspense goes on.
The German security proved to be all over the place, but they wanted the games to celebrate Germany being part of the civilized world. And they found that other people had other ideas to take advantage of that.
By 6 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, the 5th of September, the terrorists demanded transport to Cairo in Egypt.
Eventually, it was agreed that the prisoners and their Arab captors would be flown out of the country.
2 helicopters were brought in to take the terrorists and their hostages to a NATO airbase, but the police were waiting for them.
When the terrorists left the building, there were sharpshooters and marksmen in the underground garages underneath the Olympic Village, and one of the marksmen was actually spotted by one of the terrorists, so that was aborted.
Around 10:15, 2 helicopters left the Olympic Village and headed for the airfield at Fürstenfeldbruck.
Then they landed close to a Lufthansa jet which was standing by, and waiting in the darkness were army marksmen from Wiesbaden who'd been taken to the airfield earlier in a coach.
There was the real attempt that happened in Fürstenfeldbruck. The information that was relayed was faulty. There was an expectation that there would only be 5 terrorists.
2 of the guerrillas climbed from the first helicopter and walked over to inspect the jet.
In the end, there were 8, so there was not a sufficient number of sharpshooters.
And as they walked back, the firing started.
They weren't equipped particularly well. They did not have the right weapons to deal with the terrorists. And then finally, they were not trained to kill. They were trained to incapacitate, which made it relatively easy for the hostage takers to kill the hostages.
Seconds later, the second helicopter was racked by an explosion and burst into flames. By 2 o'clock, it was announced that military operations had ceased inside the base. And a few minutes later, the last Palestinian was brought out, pressed down on the backseat of a police car.
Later that evening, I think pushing midnight, the message came through that the hostages had been released and that they had captured all the terrorists.
On the evening, Konrad Ahlers, who's the spokesman for the German government, declared that all the hostages had been freed. Nobody was injured, but that was a mistake. And we do not know until this very day who actually provided him with this information. But very quickly it turned out he was totally wrong. They were all dead.
The attack ended with 5 terrorists killed by police. one of which was their spokesman, Issa, who turned out to be Latif Afif, the commander of the operation. 3 terrorists were captured, and a West German police officer was shot dead in the crossfire. 9 Israeli hostages died at the airfield, and 2 were killed at the Olympic Village earlier in the day.
You were here yesterday, were you?
I was here, yes. I just can't believe that this has happened, you know.
Do you think the game should continue after yesterday?
I don't want to comment on that. I'm not capable of making such a great decision.
I come here today on a day of mourning across the world for the young Israelis who died yesterday.
This murderous attack, which demonstrates the criminal character of the Arab terror organizations, constitutes a peril not only to Israel and her citizens, but to peace throughout the world.
There was the service, which indeed paid tribute to Israel, showed a lot of understanding to Israel.
At 10 a.m. on the 6th of September, a memorial was held inside the Olympic Stadium for the murdered Israelis by the IOC president, Avery Brundage.
The sad part about it was the president of the IOC made a speech which was horrendous. He wanted to deal with something which there was no way of dealing with. It was impossible. It had happened. It was a blight that was going to be there till the end of time.
The question is, should the games have been stopped? Had the games been stopped, it might have been very, very difficult to start them up again 4 years later.
I think that by continuing with the games, it gave support to what the Olympic beliefs are of taking part. And may the best man win, but it's not all about winning. It's about understanding other people and playing fair.
Later that day, the Israeli team left the Games and were followed by Egypt over the next few days as the funerals started to take place.
If nothing else, we hope the grief that we're suffering, the strain that David's suffering, will help the world to recognize there's got to be an end to hostages, guerrillas, kidnapping.
The Munich mayor accompanied the dead Israelis to Israel, bringing them back. There was a lot of sorrow and pain and mourning. The 5 dead Palestinians were flown back to Libya, where they were given a hero's burial. The Israelis struck back very, very quickly and very, very harshly. Just within a few days, you have bombing raids on Palestinian settlements and hunting down everybody the Mossad suspected to be in cahoots or being responsible for the Munich attack.
On the 29th of October 1972, Lufthansa Flight 615 was hijacked by 2 Palestinians.
They blackmailed German authorities into releasing their jailed friends.
The German federal government allowed for those 3 remaining Palestinians to be flown out to Tripoli in return for the freeing of that jet, which there were always discussions about whether that was based on a deal, whether that hijacking wasn't really a real hijacking because there were suspiciously few people on that Lufthansa plane.
On the 31st of October, the freed terrorists held a press conference after arriving in Tripoli that was broadcast around the world.
Did you expect to be freed so soon?
Of course, because I trust my friends and I was very sure that I will go free one day.
Do you regret the death of the 11 Israelis?
Really, we want to kill that Israeli at that time because we want to get free our prisoners in Israeli prisons.
Do you think, looking back on it now, that you achieved anything in the Munich operation?
They have made their voice heard by the universe or the world who has not been hearing before.
It's believed that the Israeli Wrath of God operation killed 2 of the surviving terrorists in the following years, and the 3rd, Jamal al-Ghashi, has been in hiding ever since.
Life, as always, has to go on. But nobody who was in Munich in 1972 will forget what happened there.
It was a very, very important event. It was a propaganda success for the Palestinians. There's no doubt about it. And the conflict in the Middle East is a conflict until this very day, has not ended, has not been resolved, despite many efforts.
Whilst considered a short-term propaganda success for the Palestinians, the Munich massacre was a disaster for the Olympics and would only strengthen Israel's resolve against Arab terrorist groups.
It's very difficult, as we've found out many times, to stop people who don't mind if they are killed in what they're trying to do.
This famous photograph showed the kind of dramatic effect that terrorism could have on such an event, such a spectacle where the world was coming together to celebrate.
It's the horror, the terror, the faceless person, the murderer, the person who's going to come out and kill you for religious reasons or for political reasons. For that to happen there is the shock, and of course it works for the terrorist. It was a huge story, shocked the world.
I was growing up being raised largely by a single mother in the 1980s, and I began to aspire to be Nelson Mandela, and somehow, not having a father in my life, he became that father figure.
If Mr. Mandela gives a commitment that he will not make himself guilty of committing acts of violence for the furtherance of political objectives, I will in principle be prepared to consider his release.
Everybody's standing around nervous as hell. You know, it's a big moment.
Nobody knew who this man had become and what he was going to look like as he came out of prison.
There's Mr. Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
It was so emotional, and guys were like, we were just crying.
This is Winnie Mandela next to him.
You shoot, and eventually, you know, you see the frame.
I can't think of an image that conveys more strength than those two individuals at that point in human history. I really can't.
I was born in South Africa, lived in Johannesburg. I went to a white-only school. One of my school friends came to play in our garden once, and my mother had driven up in the car with a man beside her in the car seat, and it was a black man. And my friend had never seen a white woman and a black man in the same section of a car. My parents were Joe Slovo, he was a lawyer, and my mother was Ruth First, who was a journalist, who were one of the few white South Africans who joined the struggle against apartheid.
I'm a privileged white guy who lived in a white suburb, who went to white schools. You know, imagine being black, being suppressed and treated like dirt. I wanted to be a photographer, but we didn't really know how to even get into it. And as soon as I qualified in my apprenticeship, I left and kind of freelanced and ended up on the Rand Daily Mail. And then I got a contract with the Associated Press.
In June 1964, after the Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela was convicted of plotting to overthrow the white South African government and was sentenced to life imprisonment on Robben Island.
We do interviews at the Rand Daily Mail of young guys coming out of Robben Island who had met Mandela. They wanted to use violence against guards and stuff, and they would get a message to come and see Nelson Mandela. Madiba would tell them that that's not the way to deal with it, that, you know. And so when you start interviewing people that had that kind of experience with him, you start building up, you know, a completely different image of who this guy was.
Growing up in Tottenham during the late 70s, 1980s, like lots of inner city areas in Britain, whether it was Moss Side in Manchester, Brixton in London, you became aware of Nelson Mandela because you yourself as a youth were facing injustices, mostly dished out by the local police. on young black youths. And I guess there were two roads you could go down, frankly, as a young black inner city youth in the 1980s. You could participate in some of the rioting that had gone on and be angry at the police, or you could aspire to being a lawyer. And I began to aspire to be Nelson Mandela, and somehow, not having a father in my life, he became that father figure.
Nelson Mandela has turned the tables. In the 80s, there was an organization called the United Democratic Front.
Lifting the state of emergency is not enough.
Which started demonstrating and striking, and which pulled together a huge number of people of black society and begun to be joined more by white people as well.
We've been told to stop running. Apparently there's some problem with the T-shirts.
They started actually putting together what would turn into the resistance against the apartheid system.
I joined the anti-apartheid movement long before I joined the British Labour Party. I lobbied my mother to boycott Cape apples, avocados, Barclays Bank, all because at that stage there was a big campaign to impose sanctions. And Nelson Mandela was the hero figure that spoke to my experience on the ground and into my political awakening.
The apartheid government understood that because of the pressure from outside, but particularly also because of the pressure from inside, they couldn't go on.
His quest for justice for his people really spoke into my experience, and I imagine so many people's experiences right across the world.
Some 15,000 people ignored the government ban on political protests. They used the occasion to stage a demonstration in support of the outlawed African National Congress and its imprisoned leader, Nelson Mandela.
At funerals, they weren't allowed to put the ANC flag over the coffins.
The presence of banners, flags, and posters was prohibited.
They wore khaki shirts and they had the ANC colors and stuff like that. I mean, in fact, I have a picture in Alexander Township, and they defied the ban and they put the flags over the coffin. Winnie Mandela was crying at this funeral, so there was this image of her with a tear running down her cheek. Every funeral turned into a new killing because the cops would always show up. It's just a horrible kind of continuum.
As tensions grew, Greg often found himself on the front line between the two sides in order to get his photo.
Chap's been drinking on a Saturday afternoon and sees a white guy sauntering through his place. There was a funeral. He says, produce. So I go, produce what? He says, your ID. But now the problem is that now he starts chatting to you because now he sees that you're a journalist. He realizes that you're coming there to cover stuff. And then other people come and other people come. And the next thing there's like 100 people around you. Most people are cool. Some guys are not so cool because they're saying, let's kill him. And the cops and the army guys look and see a white guy standing in a crowd of black guys, and they say, there's our communist stoker. So if they want to come to you to arrest you, the black guys are going to think that they're coming to rescue you because you're one of them. You're not going to walk away from there. There's some brutal guys out there. So when you end up with people getting burnt and stabbed or stoned to death or stuff like that, you can't shoot pictures because you're shaking, and you want to jump in to stop it. And there's all these kind of do-gooders who say, with your photographers, you could have saved them instead of taking the picture. Really? Be there. See what that does for you.
As photographer Greg English negotiated South Africa's townships,
most people are cool. Some guys are not so cool because they're saying, let's kill him.
Nelson Mandela had been in prison for more than a quarter of a century. In his absence, his wife Winnie had taken up his cause to end apartheid.
The people of this country know that Mandela will lead this country to freedom.
Because of who she was married to, she was persecuted by the regime.
That woman went through hell.
There were attacks on her house. She was sent into exile.
Brantford is really a living grave.
She was under house arrest. She had children. She was being belittled and sworn at.
And increasingly, she became a fighter.
You are under arrest.
There was a film camera shooting Winnie Mandela being arrested.
Accompany me, please.
They had brought along a woman police officer in order to arrest her. This white woman put her hand on Winnie Mandela. She went like this and she said,
"Don't drag me! I'm coming!"
No black woman had the courage to say,
"Don't drag me!"
and do it in front of camera.
I know what arrest means.
I might have done that after 3 years of that pressure, not 20 years of that pressure.
The momentum that built towards his release actually was mostly in South Africa.
We determine our own destiny.
There was a gradual strengthening of the anti-apartheid movement and the sanctions campaign, and those concerts, the Free Nelson Mandela and his birthday concerts, were about bringing to the public eye outside of South Africa.
If Mr. Mandela gives a commitment that he will not make himself guilty of committing acts of violence for the furtherance of political objectives, I will, in principle, be prepared to consider his release.
He said this move showed the government's sincerity about creating a new constitution for all South Africans.
In February 1990, the ban on the ANC was lifted, and President F.W. de Klerk ordered the release of Nelson Mandela.
It's the most wonderful news we have been waiting for.
In Cambridgeshire, a young David Lammy was meant to be doing his lunchtime duties at boarding school.
I said to the housemaster, look, I can't come to lunch today. And he said, why not? I said, because Nelson Mandela is coming out of prison. I've got to be there for it. Obviously, I meant watching it on television. And I insisted on remaining in my dorm room, waiting for this moment, and imagining my hero, my father figure, stepping out of prison for the first time.
All the cards fell together and I ended up standing outside Victor Verster prison. Every auntie and her dog, cameramen and news guys and non-news guys, all trying to get in there. Everybody standing around nervous as hell. You know, it's a big moment. Somebody steps in front of you, you're gone. You've been, all of that work can disappear in an instant.
One of the things about him coming out is nobody knew what he looked like. Nobody knew who this man had become.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
It was so emotional, and guys, we were just crying.
Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, hand in hand.
Then you see him, but he's so far away. Part of you doesn't want to shoot the frame, and other guys are being aggressive now. They're trying to bump you out of the way. So you shoot, and eventually, you know, you see the frame.
We doesn't only mean him and her. It means we, the movement, did it.
The tears just came pouring down, and out he walked and held his fist up high. I'll never forget that moment. It was a personal moment. Yeah, I mean, it was a, for me, it was a deeply personal moment.
He walked out arm in arm with Winnie and with those fists, and it was it was a long wait and more than you could have anticipated of who he had become.
And a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie.
And in all of that, you get 5 usable frames. Now you get in the cars, you're racing back, we scream through and processed our film, and then it goes off to London, and then you wait.
People running alongside the car.
It's a symbolic picture of their togetherness for something that they had fought for. And that picture, I think, is the expression of that. We did it.
I can't think of an image that conveys more strength than those two individuals at that point in human history. I really can't.
Pushing, touching the car.
That male and female energy of like unity, whether it's real or perceived, you know, it represents something beautiful, you know.
When he spoke, there was this extraordinary sense of hope at what was to come.
I stand here before you as a humble servant of you, the people.
He was the person we wanted him to be. And how many politicians can we say that of? Very few. But he was genuinely that person.
Your heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today.
My mother was killed, you know, by the apartheid state for her participation in anti-apartheid activities. So there had been a loss.
In March, Nelson Mandela was elected the deputy president of the ANC, and he started to work with President de Klerk and the government towards dismantling apartheid.
One person, one vote, a united South Africa, and the protection of fundamental human rights.
The biggest thing he brought to people was dignity. That's the only thing you can really hang on to, isn't it? If you've got dignity and you can stand up to even the police and say, this is the law that counts.
From an apartheid society, we are now walking towards a democratic system of government.
My father was the first white man to be elected to the ANC's National Executive Committee. When the negotiations began, de Klerk said he wouldn't negotiate with Mandela if my father was on Mandela's negotiating team. And Mandela said, you choose your negotiating team and I choose mine. And that was it. De Klerk had to back down.
Very good progress has been made.
Between 1990 and 1994, more people died in political violence than had in the 40 years before.
Law and order are breaking down.
You have the responsibility to behave orderly.
We will hit them as hard as we can.
We stop them. We're not going to allow the right wing or anybody else to delay this election.
Killing of innocent people.
For this slaughter, the police were warned, and they did nothing about it.
We have a cause that is just. One president, and that is Comrade Nelson Mandela.
In 1994, aged 76, Nelson Mandela voted for the first time in his life.
It is the realization of hopes and dreams that we have cherished over decades.
The day of the election, where you have the people of South Africa, black and white and young and old, in queues, snaking far into the distance to vote. I think part of what was so wonderful about that is that acknowledgement of how important democracy is, that people should have a right to say who their government should be, which had never been true in South Africa.
And in May, he was elected the first president of a democratic South Africa.
This is one of the most important moments in the life of our country.
Mr. Mandela has walked a long road and now stands at the top of the hill.
I think it represents very few people have the kind of honor and ability to fight a system and come out on top. Nelson Mandela is like one of, you know, I mean, how many people do you know to bring about that and sustain it and stay there and stay there and stay there until they finally crack it. Wow.
As my father used to say, when people ask me when's apartheid going to end, I say in 5 years' time, and I've been saying that since 1948, and one day I'm going to be right, and he was.
He's got it, and he's got that naughty glint in his eye. He's like he was a beautiful man.
What that image of Mandela sort of brought to us and why it was so emotional was because he survived.
Well, we got to go to work now.
Yes, sir.
All right, let's do it.
Thank you.
And his very survival conveyed freedom. Black and brown men and women. Freedom to be who you wanted to be was the real story of the 20th century.
It's definitely one of the best days of my life in terms of as a photographer, you know, like that whole being connected to it historically as a kid growing up there.
That glorious image that so many of us prayed and fought for is one that we have to hold on to.
The myth of Mandela is of this wonderful man, and I'm a little bit of a cynic, and I don't like people to be that wonderful, but honestly, when I was with Mandela, I thought, yeah, you are.